welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. The topic for today is Mal Waldron's The Quest. This was put out by Craft Recordings, like a couple of weeks ago in their original Jazz Classics series. That's what we're going to dive into. As always, before we get into it, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and of course, you can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. All right, so if you're not familiar with The Quest, I'm going to tell you about it. So this was recorded in 1961 and first released in 1962 on Prestige's New Jazz subsidiary label, right? So that's the purple one. So that label, for the most part, was meant to highlight, it seems to me at least, some of the more sort of modern styles of jazz for the time, with some exceptions where they were dusting off older recordings, right? Like by Art Farmer, and then reissuing them on New Jazz. So stuff that was maybe originally part of the early Prestige series was reissued as soon as the New Jazz label started. Basically, as far as I understand, as the Prestige label drifted more towards soul jazz, New Jazz was, well, kind of, again, sort of focused on the new style, right? More modern styles of jazz, like I said. This is not the first title that Original Jazz Classics, the newly rebooted Original Jazz Classics label that Kraft is running, this isn't the first time that they've tackled a New Jazz label record. So they previously did, let's see, Kenny Burrell and John Coltrane. They did Ron Carter's Where. They also released The Cats. So there are a few others, and in any event, this is the latest edition. And yeah, I was super excited about this because well, I've owned an original copy for a while, and this is in VG minus shape. Not in the best shape. And this is actually probably the third copy that I've owned over time. And I still only have a VG minus copy. So that speaks to, the difficulty of finding copies, or at least clean ones. Perhaps the fact that this album is very well loved, and so it's just difficult to find one that sounds good. Let's talk about, I guess, why I love this album so much. Maybe I'll start off with the lineup. So here we have Mal Waldron, Eric Dolphy, Booker Ervin, Ron Carter, Joe Benjamin, and Charles Persip. What I personally think is most interesting about this lineup, and one of the reasons why I love the lineup so much, is the presence of Ron Carter, not on bass, but on cello. And so actually Joe Benjamin plays bass. I don't think it's just fun that sort of Ron Carter takes on more of a melodic instrument. I just think it's really interesting that he plays it as well as he does. His playing is really nuanced and beautiful. You get a ton of character from the cello, the way that he plays it. And otherwise here, I mean, the pieces are all Mal Waldron originals. And I would say that these are some more adventurous tunes, maybe than even you're used to if you've heard Mal Waldron's work, say on prior albums, either for New Jazz or for Prestige. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say that so far, out of the titles released on Kraft's OJC reissue series, this is probably the least traditional album, or another way to put it is maybe most adventurous of the titles that they've released so far. So I want to dig into that maybe just a little bit more, so maybe so folks have an idea, I guess, of what to expect. But real quick before I do that, I guess one thing I did want to address is the packaging, just kind of briefly, because I know when folks are spending the what is it, like the 38.98 or something like that, that these retail for, you kind of want to know what you're getting, how does it compare to the original, especially since I have this original. So let me just kind of show you a couple of things. So this is my I kind of refer to it as an original. This is actually not what I would call a true original. So the indicator is that I actually only have Deep Groove on one side of my copy. This album has, probably like 3 or 4 different varieties of all purple label, records. But ideally, I think what you want with this is a wide deep groove on both sides, and I do not have that. I just have the deep groove on one side. But fortunately, my copy is not on recycled vinyl, and I have owned a copy of this previously that was. So anyway, to the packaging though. So this is what the cover looks like, and there is sort of a faint texture to it. So folks who know, New Jazz from this particular era, it's not unlike, say, the Bill Evans Sunday at the Village Vanguard title in terms of having that kind of light texture That was also something that OJC replicated for their reissue. So similarly, with this original cover, I guess what you'd want is for that sort of texture, almost like a woven sort of texture to the cover to be replicated. And I'll show you in a second that they did indeed do that. But yeah, otherwise, this is what the original cover looks like. I'll show you these side by side in just a second. What I'm going to do here is here for you is remove the shrink because I don't really care about the shrink generally speaking. Um, so obviously with these original jazz classics editions that Kraft is putting out, they do come with an OB. I keep these, but I just don't really like them. They get in the way. It's harder to put it in a sleeve. But in any event, this is what this is what the title looks like. And I don't know if you can see this, but what you should be able to see or possibly is this sort of woven texture. Now I will say that this is probably a more woven texture. It's more textured than my other cover, so it's not quite a match. This is a little bit more similar to the Sunday at the Village Vanguard title, but otherwise, I think they did a great job here matching the color scheme. Obviously, this is going to be, this is going to have sort of soil on it, and that's why it's a little bit browner. But otherwise, only major difference here, right, is the catalog number, and this is something that Kraft does every single time they replace the catalog number with their own for this series. But otherwise, these the replication of all the details on this is pretty great. No complaints, super sturdy, and yeah, it's a wonderful cover. And actually, if you look up New Jazz as a label and you just go through all of the covers that they ever put out around this time period, and I guess maybe a point of reference is catalog 8269. If you look at or around that catalog number, what you'll find is a number of titles that all had this cover format, right? So with the white and with the picture and the stripe down here. So offhand, I can think of one by Roland Alexander, Yusuf Lateef. Ron Carter's "Where" was another that kind of mimicked this. There was a Dizzy Reese album, right? There's just a bunch of different ones that all had this kind of format, and it's nice. Yeah, I just think it presents really well. So let's talk about just a couple of tracks, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail on each track, but I do want to reference a couple of things, and then I want to talk about one track in particular for a reason that you'll find out here shortly. Um, all right, so the opening track on this album is titled "Status Seeking." Remember, I mentioned all of these are Waldron originals. So one of the reasons why I love Status Seeking as much as I do is it has a very tense kind of tone to it, almost like it's a chase sequence from like a 60s French movie or something. Like listen to it and then you'll kind of get that vibe. It's like quasi sort of Euro film like chase sequence, and it's accentuated by just a really fast tempo and sort of frenetic piano pulsing line that Mal Waldron plays. It's just really exciting, but this piece is also, I think, a good entry to the album because even though it's exciting, it's also atonal in terms of the notes that Dolphy chooses to play over Waldron's piano. So it's kind of your first sort of clue that this is going to be something that isn't quite as I don't want to say, I mean, maybe melodic is the right word, but it's not quite as pretty, maybe is a good way to put it. But it's still a fantastic tune. It's one of the highlights, I think. So the next one is Duquility. I think that's probably how that's meant to be pronounced. This track is, on the other hand, much quieter, more space, some really nice layered melodies with Booker Ervin and Eric Dolphy. And in fact, I think the two of them layer on top of each other at various points in this album very, very well, but not because they're playing in the same style or anything. It's just because they're very different styles happen to sort of meld together very well. And I can't necessarily put my finger on it other than that. Obviously, they're expert musicians. I believe both played with didn't both play with Mingus at some point. I want to say Dolphy was playing with Mingus for a little bit in addition to Irvin. But anyway, it's very clear that they're just very sort of harmonious, playing between the two of them. So what I would say on this track that I noticed though, that's also a little bit of a recurring theme for the rest of the album is that the piano is very quiet here. I do get the sense that it's intentional because you don't actually want to turn up the volume on your amp, because the horns when they come in are just really loud when they come in, and so it makes me think that these dynamics, right, of the softer piano and the louder horns is intentional, and that's fine. It's just that I was kind of like, oh wow, the piano's kind of soft here. Um, what I would also say though is that Ron Carter's cello here, really nice character. I mean, he just plays the cello so beautifully here with really nice vibrato, and so I think that that's a highlight as well. The third track, I said I wasn't going to do track by track. I'm not going to cover all of them. 13 is the title of piece number three. And this one is complex in it's like a time signature that I can't quite pick out because it changes constantly, it feels like. It's fast though, it's a fast tune. And funnily enough, the bass and drums keep a consistent pulse. And so it's very interesting to me that at the same time that it feels like the time signature is changing just constantly, if all you're hearing is the bass and drums, you wouldn't be able to get that at all because it's this constant pulsing thing. And so it's I think what gives you the sense that the time signature is changing is more about the phrasing of the horns. And so it's just yeah, like I said, it's a very interesting dynamic here. Um, One other track that I want to pick out before I go to the what I think is a highlight of the album, Warp and Woof. So this is the second track on side two, probably the most traditional piece here in terms of structure, more sort of common, typical compositional devices is what I would say. So even though this piece is in 5/4, it's not like a waltz 5/4, and so it's not as I don't know. It's you're not going to get like a Dave Brubeck vibe here. So Eric Dolphy plays the first solo here, and it's actually pretty amazing and just really well recorded. Very rich sound to it. And when Booker Irvin comes in and sort of joins them, they go back and forth and play sort of on top of each other. I just think it's a really, really nice effect. I mentioned that these two musicians just play very well together, and I think here is another great example. All right, so what I wanted to talk about next is Warm Canto. So this is the first track on side two, and it's kind of the highlight of the album, as I alluded to, and so I'm actually going to kind of end on this in terms of at least the tracks that I'm going to discuss. So I personally think that Warm Canto is one of the most beautiful jazz compositions I've ever heard in my life. If I was creating a video about the five most beautiful jazz tracks ever recorded, this would certainly make the list. And I'd have a hard time not putting it up in like, the one, two, or three spot. And I'm not kidding. I'm not just saying that because I happen to be talking about this album. Now, I will say that some of the same sort of audio related notes that I've mentioned earlier are present here in terms of the piano and even the drums being sort of more muted than I would expect. But the clarinet is very prominent. The bass is very rich here, even if it's not as rich elsewhere. And I just think that the cello and bass sort of doubled line on this piece that sort of introduces and exits the song is really really nice, just really nice. And so I think that if there's anything that's going to sort of suck anybody into this if there's any track that's going to suck everybody into this album, it's going to be Warm Canto, and I think it has a little bit of that reputation too. I think people kind of have gotten wise to the fact that that track is on this, and it's one of the reasons why the Quest is loved as much as it is, I think. Now here's kind of a point where I did decide to compare, especially for my favorite track, right? And one of my favorite tracks ever. I had to do a little bit of comparison, and again, VG minus shape. Like this is not any way to hear this album. At least in terms of what I have access to, this is the reissue is definitely the way to hear it. So what I wanted to mention though is that there is sort of a difference between the original and the reissue here, where I actually found that on the original, the piano feels more prominent. Now, I don't necessarily know that it's louder. It may just be louder relative to the other instruments, compared to the reissue. The drums are still not particularly detailed, and they're kind of soft in both editions. So what I would say, and I was kind of listening for this, the cymbal work in the original pressing is almost entirely lost. And it's don't get me wrong, it's nuanced, but it's almost entirely lost. It's like barely present, and it's a shame because at the end, there's this like bass and cello line toward the end, and this kind of like sort of flourish thing that's just it's just kind of, I mean, you can tell that there's a lot happening. You just can't always necessarily hear it. and it didn't occur to me as much as when I heard this reissue. And I will say that you can hear those details better in the OJC, but I would still say that it's almost like some of the instruments, including piano and drums, are being played like down the hall, and it may just be that the recording, suffered a bit, or just wasn't as much attention to detail on that particular day. So here's the thing though, even having said that and still standing behind the fact that Warm Canto is my favorite, track, and yes, the piano is a little bit more muted, it felt like, relative to the other instruments, but I still prefer the OJC edition across the board, by the way. And, part of that, VG minus original. Um, my conclusion, on the one hand, may be that this wasn't the best recorded album. The cello sounds great, the horns do, the piano has moments, but overall is quite soft. The drums are also in the background, the bass isn't very detailed relative to some of the other OJC titles. Now, I also want to counter a little bit of what I just said, because albums that are more, what I'll call non-traditional in terms of compositions and solos. And I say non-traditional because I don't want to call this free jazz, because it isn't really, and I don't really want to call it avant-garde either. But I guess what I'd say is albums like this, where not all the playing is for the sake of clarity of tone or phrasing. Um, and I just think that in those cases, sometimes they don't necessarily have the ingredients for what would be objectively called a gorgeous recording, but the recording is still beautiful because the music is beautiful, right? If that makes sense. So, it's almost like, if I was to compare it to somebody else, it's like complaining about a Charles Mingus album because the dozen instruments that are sometimes soloing on top of one another don't have enough like separation. So it's like, focusing in, I think, on some of these things that you think are indicators of a great recording, it doesn't always necessarily mean that that was the artistic intent, or that was the sound that the artist wanted. And I think in this album, and the fact that it is a little bit, again, it is a little bit more sort of avant-garde, or a little bit more non-traditional. And I think that Mal Waldron, I think that one of the highlights here really is Mal Waldron's creativity with his compositions and his sort of arrangements. It occurred to me, I was listening to this, that there's moments where the piano, yes, it's soft, but the horns are really loud, which makes me think it's intentional. And, even on Warm Canto, where some of these things just feel like they're like a device, like the piano and the drums being in the like pushed to the back, like almost like it's out of the room, or this kind of like, it's not that it's faint, it's just it's more muted, and it's like softer and not as much in the mix. And to some degree, I just think that that may indeed be what Mal Waldron heard in his head when he wrote this composition down. Because even with all of these things about me saying, this is what I hear and this is what I would expect it to be, considering other OJC titles, it doesn't change the fact that it isn't just an absolutely beautiful composition, and that the album itself isn't also beautiful. So, in conclusion, I hope that some of my comments don't make it seem like I'm sort of wishy-washy, or not willing to put a stake in the sand. I think I stand by both sides of the issue. I think that there are, there are components of, say, the recording and how it sounds, that maybe I wish that they were more detailed, and it was more balanced. But at the same time, you kind of have to respect the artist's intent, and it's a beautiful album for what it is. So I would say, a couple of things. One is that this is superior to my my original, because my original is not in the best shape. But even so, I think that this is just really well presented. And I think that I think it stands out compared to the original. And I would also kind of sort of caution people, I suppose, that this is not exactly traditional. It's not, and you have to have a little bit, maybe a little bit more of an open mind. Again, it's not free jazz. It's not, it's not something that you can't follow, but it also isn't the most sort of traditional in terms of the melodies and chord progressions and things like that. So kind of know that going in, but at the same time, I stand behind the fact that this is an amazing album, and to be able to hear a clean rendition of Warm Canto on vinyl, I think is sort of worth the price in and of itself. So those are my comments on this release. Thanks very much. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, and I'll see you next time.